The starship descended through clouds the color of blood, and Alpha Kesrek watched it from his balcony with eyes that had seen 1,000 kills. Eyes that belonged to the most feared predator on Varkith Prime. He stood 8 feet tall, his body covered in scales that could turn away blades, his claws capable of tearing through metal, his fangs designed by evolution to pierce bone and rip flesh from living prey. The Varkith had conquered their jungle world through strength and violence, and they had carried that same brutal efficiency into the stars, building an empire on the bones of weaker species. Now the humans were coming, and Kesrek could barely contain his amusement at the thought. He had studied the reports from the Galactic Council, reading about these strange creatures from a distant blue world, and he had laughed at what he found. Humans had no claws, no fangs, no armor, no venom. Their skin was soft and tore easily under the slightest pressure. They moved slowly compared to true predators, and their senses were dull and weak. The Council had warned that humans were dangerous, that they had spread across the galaxy with surprising speed, that they had defeated species far stronger than themselves. But Kesrek dismissed these warnings as the paranoid ramblings of cowards. What could such soft creatures possibly do against the might of the Varkith? The diplomatic vessel landed in the courtyard below, its hull gleaming in the red sunlight. And Kesrek descended to meet his guests with the confidence of an apex predator, greeting prey animals who had wandered into his territory. The airlock opened with a hiss, and the humans emerged. Kesrek's first impression confirmed everything he had believed. They were small, standing barely 6 feet at their tallest, with flat faces and round eyes that showed too much white. Their teeth were blunt and useless, designed for chewing plants rather than tearing meat. Their hands had no claws, just soft fingers with weak little nails that could never pierce flesh. They wore clothing that covered their vulnerable bodies, hiding the soft skin that Kesrek knew he could rip open with a single swipe of his hand. One human stepped forward, and Kesrek noted with interest that this one was female. She had dark hair pulled back from her face, brown eyes that met his gaze without flinching, and a smile that seemed permanently fixed on her lips. "Alpha Kesrek," she said, her voice soft and musical. Nothing like the growls and snarls that pass for speech among his people. "I am Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I have been assigned as your cultural liaison for the duration of our negotiations." She extended her hand, palm open, in what Kesrek recognized as a human greeting ritual. He looked at that hand with contempt, noting how small it was, how fragile the bones beneath the skin must be, how easily he could crush it in his grip. He did not take it. "You may enter my domain," he growled, his voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. "But understand that you are here by my permission alone, human." If the insult bothered her, she did not show it. Her smile never wavered, and she simply lowered her hand and nodded, following as Kesrek turned and walked toward his fortress. The negotiations would take 30 solar cycles, 30 cycles of talking and arguing and discussing terms that Kesrek found tedious and beneath him. He was a warrior, not a diplomat, but the Varkith High Council had insisted that he host these humans, that he show them the power and glory of the Varkith people. He would do his duty, but he would not pretend to respect these soft creatures. In the days that followed, Kesrek permitted Elena to observe his household, confident that she posed no threat to anyone within his walls. She wandered the corridors with a translator device in her ear, watching everything with those strained round eyes, taking notes on a small electronic pad, asking questions that Kesrek found irritating but harmless. She wanted to know about Varkith customs, about their history, about their family structures and social hierarchies. Kesrek answered when he felt like it and ignored her when he did not. She never complained, never pushed, never showed any sign of frustration. She simply smiled and waited and watched. His cubs encountered her on the 3rd day. Ren and Desik were young, barely past their first molt, but they were already fierce and proud, already learning the ways of dominance that would serve them throughout their lives. They found Elena in the garden, sitting on a stone bench and observing the hunting birds that Kesrak kept in the high branches. Ren approached first, his scales bristling, his young fangs bared in a display of aggression. "What are you?" he snarled, circling her like a predator stalking prey. "You smell wrong. You look wrong. You do not belong here." Desik joined his brother, the two cubs positioning themselves on either side of the human, their claws extended, their muscles tensed for attack. Elena looked at them calmly, her smile gentle, her body language relaxed and unthreatening. "I am a guest of your father," she said softly. "I mean you no harm." Ren lunged forward, snapping his jaws inches from her face, a test to see if she would flinch, if she would show fear, if she would react like the prey animal he believed her to be. She flinched. She pulled back, her eyes widening, her hands rising in a defensive gesture that made both cubs laugh with cruel delight. "She is afraid," Desik said, his voice dripping with contempt. "She is nothing but a weak little thing pretending to be important." They lost interest quickly after that, wandering off to find more entertaining prey, leaving Elena alone in the garden. Kesrak had watched the entire encounter from his balcony above. He noted with satisfaction that the human knew her place. She understood the hierarchy, understood that she was beneath the Varkith, understood that she existed here only because they allowed it. This was good. This was proper. This was exactly how things should be. He returned to his chambers, dismissing the human from his thoughts. She was nothing, a minor annoyance, a soft creature who would serve her purpose and then leave. She posed no threat to his household, no danger to his cubs, no challenge to his authority. The Galactic Council had been wrong about humans. They were exactly what they appeared to be, weak, harmless, and utterly beneath the notice of true predators. Alpha Kesrak was certain of this. He had never been more wrong about anything in his entire life. Elena watched everything. This was what she had been trained to do, what she had spent 15 years learning in the diplomatic corps, what had made her the best cultural liaison in the human fleet. She watched, and she learned, and she remembered, building a picture of Varkith society that no outsider had ever assembled before. The Varkith valued strength above all other qualities. Every interaction was a test of dominance, every conversation a subtle battle for position and hierarchy. The strong ruled, the weak obeyed, and those who fell between rose or fell based on their ability to prove their worth through violence. Cubs began fighting almost from birth, establishing their place in the social order through blood and pain. Elena had watched Ren and Desik battle 3 times in her first week alone, watched them tear at each other with claws and fangs, while the adult Varkith looked on with approval. This was how they learned. This was how they grew strong. This was the only way they knew. Adults settled their disputes through ritualized combat, matches that could range from simple wrestling to battles that ended in death. The weak were culled or subjugated, forced into servant roles where they existed only to serve those more powerful than themselves. It was brutal and bloody and horrifying by human standards, but Elena did not judge. She simply observed. She noticed things that the Varkith did not notice about themselves. She saw how Ren favored his left foreleg after one particularly vicious fight. A subtle weakness that he tried to hide, but that showed in the way he moved, in the way he positioned himself, in the way he hesitated for just a fraction of a second before striking. She saw how Desik's aggression masked deep fear, how he attacked first and hardest because he was terrified of being seen as weak, how his snarls and growls were the desperate sounds of a creature trying to convince himself as much as others. She saw how Alpha Kesrak maintained his authority through constant displays of power, how he could never show softness or mercy without risking challenges from those beneath him, How the burden of leadership was slowly crushing something inside him that he probably did not even know existed. The other Varkith ignored Elena completely. To them, she was furniture, background noise, a creature so far beneath their notice that tracking her movements would be a waste of mental energy. They spoke freely in front of her, discussing politics and grudges and secret ambitions as though she were not even present. They never considered that she understood every word, that her translator captured every nuance, that her trained mind was cataloging every piece of information for later analysis. She used this invisibility well. She recorded conversations that would have been hidden from any Varkith outsider. She mapped the power structures and alliance networks that defined life in Kesrak's household. She identified the ambitious subordinates who dreamed of challenging the Alpha, the loyal servants who would die for their master, the neutral parties who would follow whoever emerged victorious from any conflict. At night, alone in her quarters, Elena exercised. She did pull-ups on a bar she had installed above her door, lifting her body weight over and over until her muscles burned and sweat dripped down her face. She did deadlifts with the heavy equipment cases she had brought from the ship, straining against weights that would have surprised anyone who saw only her slim frame and gentle smile. She practiced combat drills that she had learned on the mining colony where she had grown up. A heavy-gravity world where humans had to be strong just to survive, where weakness meant death and only the tough endured. Her childhood had not been gentle. The colony had been a harsh place, a world where the gravity pulled at your bones and the environment tried to kill you every single day. Elena had learned to fight before she learned to read. She had broken her first bone at age 6, had killed her first dangerous animal at age 10, had survived a mine collapse at age 14 that had left her trapped in darkness for 3 days before rescue arrived. She had come out of that darkness different, harder, with a patience and stillness that most humans never developed. She had learned that the greatest advantage a human could have was being underestimated. Now she used that advantage every day. She smiled and spoke softly and flinched at loud noises, playing the role of the harmless diplomat, the weak little human who posed no threat to anyone. The Varkith saw what they expected to see. They saw a prey animal, a soft creature, a being so far beneath them that she was not worth a moment of concern. They never looked deeper. They never wondered why the Galactic Council had warned them about humans. They never asked themselves how a species with no claws, no fangs, no armor, no venom could have spread across the galaxy and defeated enemies far more powerful than themselves. Elena knew the answer to that question. Humans were persistence predators, evolved on a world where they had hunted by chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They did not need to be faster or stronger than their targets. They just needed to keep going, to never give up, to outlast anything that tried to escape or oppose them. And they had another advantage, one that most aliens never understood until it was too late. Humans were social predators, pack hunters who had learned to work together, to coordinate, to share information and strategies across generations. A single human might be weak. A group of humans was terrifying. And a human who had been watching and learning and planning was the most dangerous thing of all. Elena finished her exercises and showered, washing away the sweat and the tension of another day spent pretending to be harmless. She reviewed her notes, adding new observations to the growing file that would eventually become the most comprehensive study of Varkith culture ever assembled. She thought about Ren and Desik, about the 2 cubs who had tried to intimidate her in the garden. She had seen something in them that day, something beneath the aggression and the fear. She had seen potential. They were young, still forming, still capable of becoming something more than the brutal killers their society demanded. But they would never reach that potential if they continued on their current path. The rivalry between them was growing more intense every day, fed by their father's approval of violence and their society's worship of strength. Soon they would fight for real. Soon one of them would die. Elena made a decision that night, a decision that would change everything. She would not let that happen. She did not know yet how she would prevent it, did not know what she would do when the moment came, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would not stand by and watch two children kill each other. She was a human. She protected those who could not protect themselves. It was what her species did, what they had always done, what made them dangerous in ways that predators like the Varkith could never understand. Elena smiled in the darkness of her quarters, a smile that was nothing like the gentle expression she showed the world. This smile was older, harder, full of the patience of a hunter who had chosen her prey. The Varkith thought they knew what she was. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The 20-second cycle began like any other, with red sunlight streaming through the windows of Kesrak's fortress and the sounds of the household stirring to life. Elena rose early as she always did, completing her exercises before the first servants began their rounds, maintaining the illusion of weakness that had served her so well. She ate breakfast alone in her quarters, reviewing the day's schedule of diplomatic meetings and cultural observations. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing warned her that this would be the day that changed everything. She made her way to the nursery wing around midday, following her regular routine of observing the cubs during their training sessions. Ren and Desik were practicing combat forms under the watchful eye of an elderly trainer, a scarred warrior named Vorak, who had served the household for 40 years. The cubs moved through the exercises with the fluid grace of natural predators, their young bodies already deadly, their instincts already honed for violence. Elena watched from her usual position near the doorway, silent and still, invisible to the Varkith, who had long since stopped noticing her presence. She saw immediately that something was different today. The tension between the brothers had grown worse overnight, their rivalry reaching a breaking point that even the trainer seemed to sense. Ren's movements were sharp and aggressive, his eyes locked on his brother with an intensity that went beyond practice. Desik responded with equal hostility, his scales bristling, his young fangs bared in a constant snarl. They were not training anymore. They were preparing to fight for real. Vorak saw it too, and a slow smile spread across his scarred face. This was what he had been waiting for, what Varkith trainers always hoped to see, the moment when cubs stopped playing at violence and embraced it fully. He stepped back, giving the brothers room, his posture making clear that he would not interfere. Alpha Kesrak appeared on the balcony above the training floor, drawn by some instinct that told him something important was happening. He looked down at his sons with cold approval, his arms folded across his massive chest. Other Varkith gathered as word spread through the household, servants and warriors alike coming to witness what everyone sensed would be a battle to remember. They formed a loose circle around the cubs, their eyes bright with anticipation, their bodies tense with excitement. No one moved to stop what was about to happen. No one even considered it. This was natural. This was proper. This was the way of the Varkith. The strong survived and the weak died. Ren struck first. He launched himself at his brother with a roar that shook the windows, his claws extended, his jaws gaping wide. Desik met the charge head-on, refusing to give ground, and the two cubs collided in an explosion of scales and fury. They tumbled across the floor, tearing at each other with savage intensity, their blood spattering the stone beneath them. Elena watched with growing horror as the fight escalated beyond anything she had witnessed before. This was not a dominance display. This was not a training exercise. This was attempted murder. Desik's fangs found Ren's throat, piercing the softer scales there, drawing a spray of blood that painted the floor crimson. Ren screamed in pain and rage, his claws raking across his brother's belly, opening wounds that spilled purple-red onto the ground. The watching Varkith made no move to intervene. Some were actually cheering. Kesrak watched from above, his expression cold and calculating, clearly prepared to accept whichever outcome the fight produced. One fewer mouth to feed, Elena realized with sick certainty. One stronger heir remaining. He was going to let his children kill each other. Something inside Elena snapped. She did not think about what she was doing. She did not consider the consequences. She did not calculate the risks or weigh the diplomatic implications. She simply moved. Her body exploded into motion, years of training taking over. Muscles that had been forged in heavy gravity and honed through endless practice, propelling her across the training floor faster than any Varkith eye could track. She reached the cubs in less than a second, her hand shooting out with surgical precision. Her right hand seized Isaac by the scruff of his neck, fingers finding the pressure points she had identified through weeks of careful observation. Her left arm hooked around Ren's chest, pulling him back even as his claws slashed at his brother. She wrenched them apart with a force that sent both cubs tumbling in opposite directions. Isaac weighed nearly 200 pounds. Ren weighed even more. Together they outmassed Elena by a factor of 3. It did not matter. She had leverage and technique and the strength of a body built on a world where gravity itself was an enemy. The cubs hit the ground hard, too shocked to immediately rise, their young minds struggling to process what had just happened. A claw had caught Elena's forearm during the separation, tearing through her sleeve and opening a gash that bled freely down her wrist. She did not seem to notice. She stood between the cubs now, her body positioned to block any renewed attack, her breathing steady and controlled despite the violence of her movement. Her face was calm. Her eyes were not. They burned with an intensity that made even the watching warriors take an unconscious step backward. "Enough," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the sudden silence of the nursery. The word was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was a command, delivered with absolute authority, backed by a will that would not bend. No one moved. No one spoke. Every Varkith in the room stared at the small human woman who had just done something impossible. She had intervened in a sacred ritual of their people. She had physically overpowered 2 cubs who should have been able to tear her apart. She had moved with speed that their predator eyes had barely been able to follow. And now she stood there, bleeding and unafraid, as though she had done nothing more remarkable than picking up a fallen object. On the balcony above, Alpha Kesrak slowly unfolded his arms. His eyes were fixed on Elena with an expression that no one in his household had ever seen before. For the first time in his life, the apex predator of Varkith Prime was looking at something he did not understand. And somewhere deep in his hunter's brain, an ancient instinct was beginning to whisper a warning. Something was very wrong with what he thought he knew about humans. The nursery remained frozen in silence, every eye fixed on the impossible scene before them. Elena stood motionless between the 2 fallen cubs, her bleeding arm hanging at her side, her posture relaxed yet somehow radiating a presence that filled the entire room. Ren groaned and tried to rise, his wounds making movement difficult. Desik was already pushing himself up, his eyes blazing with rage and humiliation. He snarled at the human who had dared to interfere, his young fangs bared, his claws scraping against the stone floor. "You dare touch me?" he growled, his voice cracking with fury. "You are nothing. You are prey. You are." Elena's hand moved. It was not fast. It was not aggressive. It was simply there, suddenly, resting on the side of Desik's neck with a gentleness that somehow stopped his words more effectively than any blow. Her fingers were positioned precisely over the nerve cluster that controlled breathing. Desik froze. Every Varkith in the room froze. Alpha Kesrak felt his blood turn to ice as understanding crashed through him like a wave of cold water. He knew that nerve cluster. Every Varkith knew it. It was the death point, the place where a single sharp strike could paralyze the breathing muscles and end a life in seconds. Varkith warriors trained for years to learn that precise location. The human had found it without looking, and she was not pressing. Her fingers rested there like a gentle caress, like a mother's touch, like the most loving gesture imaginable. But the positioning was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Kesrak descended from the balcony slowly, his massive body moving with a care he had never shown before. His eyes never left Elena's hand, tracking it with the desperate focus of a predator who suddenly realized he might be the prey. The other Varkith parted before him, sensing that something fundamental had shifted, that the universe itself had tilted on its axis. Kesrak stopped 3 paces from Elena, close enough to strike, close enough to kill, but he made no aggressive move. His hunter's mind was working furiously, processing everything he had just witnessed, reinterpreting every moment of the past 22 cycles through new understanding. She had moved faster than his eyes could track. His eyes, the eyes of an apex predator, evolved over millions of years to detect the slightest motion. She had overpowered 2 cubs who outweighed her combined. Her thin arms, her soft skin, her fragile-looking body had produced force that made no sense. That violated everything he understood about physiology. And now she stood with his heir's life literally in her hands, her expression calm, her breathing steady, her body language showing no fear whatsoever. "Remove your hand from my son," Kesrak said, his voice carefully controlled, revealing none of the turmoil churning inside him. Elena looked up at him, meeting his gaze directly, and Kesrak felt something he had not experienced in 40 years of brutal dominance: uncertainty. "He needs medical attention," she said, her voice still soft, still gentle, still carrying that musical quality that had fooled him so completely. "They both do. The wounds are serious, but not fatal if treated quickly." She removed her hand from Desik's neck, the movement slow and deliberate, and Kesrak noticed that his son did not immediately attack her. The cub was staring at Elena with an expression Kesrak had never seen on any Varkith face before. It was not fear exactly, although fear was certainly part of it. It was something closer to awe. She had dominated him utterly, completely, in a way that left no room for argument or denial. And then she had let him live. In Varkith terms, she had claimed him. Ren was watching too, his wounds forgotten, his eyes fixed on the human who had torn him away from his brother, with strength that should have been impossible. Both cubs looked at Elena the way young predators look at a creature they cannot classify, something that did not fit into any category their minds had been trained to recognize. Kesrak's thoughts raced as he assembled the pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed. He thought of every human he had encountered over the years, every diplomat and trader and scientist he had dismissed as harmless. They all moved like Elena. They all spoke like Elena. They all smiled like Elena. They were all small and soft and clawless, and they had all made him feel superior, made him feel powerful, made him feel safe. But Elena was not safe. Elena was the most dangerous thing in this room. And if she was dangerous, then every human he had ever met might be dangerous too. Kesrak thought of the Galactic Council's warnings, the words he had dismissed as cowardly paranoia. Persistence predators, they had called the humans. They do not need to be stronger. They just need you to forget what they are. He had forgotten. He had looked at blunt teeth and assumed they could not bite. He had looked at soft skin and assumed it covered weak muscle. He had looked at clawless hands and assumed they could not kill. But those hands had just separated 2 fighting cubs with the casual ease of an adult pulling apart quarreling children. Those hands had found the death point on a Varkith neck without conscious thought. Those hands could snap his heir's spine before anyone in this room could move to stop them. And Elena had chosen not to do it. That was the thought that kept echoing through Kesrak's mind. She could have killed Desik. She could have killed Ren. She could probably kill every Varkith in this room if she decided to, moving with that impossible speed, striking with that impossible precision. But she had chosen mercy. She had chosen to protect instead of destroy. She had chosen to save his sons' lives when he had been prepared to let them kill each other. Kesrek looked at Elena Vasquez, really looked at her for the first time. He saw past the soft skin and the gentle smile and the musical voice. He saw the lean muscle hidden beneath her clothing. He saw the steady hands that had moved like striking serpents. He saw the ancient, patient intelligence in her eyes, the eyes of a predator so confident in its own power that it did not need to prove anything to anyone. She was not prey. She had never been prey. She was something far more terrifying. A predator that chose to appear harmless, a killer that preferred to heal, a creature of immense power that measured its strength not by what it destroyed, but by what it protected. The Galactic Council had been right about humans. They were dangerous beyond anything Kesrek had imagined. But standing in the nursery, watching this small woman tend to his wounded sons with gentle hands that could have ended their lives, Kesrek began to wonder if dangerous was necessarily the same as threatening. Perhaps there were different kinds of predators in the universe. Perhaps some of them were worth knowing better. The medical team arrived within minutes, summoned by servants who had finally remembered how to move. Varkith healers swarmed around the two cubs, applying treatments and sealing wounds with the efficiency of a species that dealt with violence daily. Elena stepped back to let them work, her own wounded arm still bleeding, still ignored as though it were someone else's injury. Kesrek watched her watching his sons, and he found himself unable to look away. She cared about them. The realization hit him with unexpected force. This human woman, this creature he had dismissed and ignored and treated with contempt, actually cared whether his cubs lived or died. Not because of politics or diplomacy or any strategic calculation. She cared because they were children, because they were young, because they had been about to die, and she could not stand by and let it happen. The medical team finished their work, declaring both cubs stable, and servants carried them to recovery chambers where they would heal under careful supervision. The crowd dispersed slowly, the watching Varkith returning to their duties with backward glances and whispered conversations that would spread through the household like fire. Soon everyone would know what had happened in the nursery. Soon the story would spread beyond the fortress, beyond the city, beyond the planet itself. A human had intervened in a Varkith dominance fight. A human had touched an alpha's son and lived. A human had revealed herself to be something nobody had imagined. But for now, in the quiet aftermath, only Kesrek and Elena remained. They stood facing each other in the blood-spattered nursery, predator and predator, neither willing to look away first. "Your arm needs treatment," Kesrek said finally, his voice rough with emotions he could not name. Elena glanced down at the wound, as though noticing it for the first time. "It is not serious," she said. "The claw missed anything important." "You should not have interfered," Kesrek continued, but his voice lacked conviction. "It was not your place. It was not your right. It was against every law of my people." "I know," Elena said simply. "You could have been killed. Yes. My warriors could have torn you apart for touching my heir." "Yes. Then why?" Kesrek demanded, stepping closer, looming over her with all his height and mass. Trying to intimidate, trying to understand. Why risk yourself for cubs you do not even know? Children of a species you have no reason to care about. Elena looked up at him, and her smile was different now. Not the gentle mask she had worn for 22 cycles, but something real and sad and ancient. "Because where I come from," she said softly, "we do not measure strength by what we destroy. We measure it by what we protect." Kesrek stared at her. The words made no sense to him, contradicting everything he had been taught since birth. Strength was dominance. Strength was victory. Strength was standing over your fallen enemies and roaring your triumph to the sky. How could protection be strength? How could mercy be power? How could choosing not to kill be anything other than weakness? I do not understand, he admitted, and the words felt strange in his mouth. The Alpha of Varkith Prime, confessing ignorance to a creature half his size. Elena nodded, as though she had expected this. Sit with me, she said, gesturing to a bench along the wall. Let me tell you a story. Kesrak hesitated, pride warring with curiosity, and then did something he had never done before. He sat beside a human and listened. Elena told him about Earth, about the blue world where her species had evolved. She told him about early humans, weak and slow compared to the predators that hunted them, surviving only through cooperation and cunning. She told him about the first tribes, groups of humans who protected each other, who shared food and shelter and knowledge, who treated weakness as something to be healed rather than culled. She told him about the long journey to the stars, about the challenges humanity had faced and overcome, not through individual strength, but through collective effort. And she told him about children. Human children were helpless for years, completely dependent on adults for survival. Any society that killed its weak young would have died out in a generation. So humans had evolved differently than the Varkith. They had evolved to protect, to nurture, to see value in those who could not defend themselves. Your cubs are strong, Elena said finally, her eyes meeting Kesrak's with calm certainty. But they could be so much more than killers. They could be leaders who inspire rather than dominate, warriors who protect rather than destroy, Varkith who build rather than tear down. She paused, letting her words sink in. They could be like you, Alpha Kesrak, but they could also be better if you let them. Kesrak was silent for a long moment. He thought about his own life, about the rivals he had killed, the challengers he had crushed, the constant exhausting vigilance required to maintain his position at the top. He thought about his sons, about the path they were walking, about the blood they would spill and the enemies they would make. He thought about what it would mean to measure strength differently, to value protection over destruction, to see mercy as power rather than weakness. It went against everything he knew. It contradicted the deepest teachings of his people. It would be seen as madness by every Varkith who heard of it. But looking at Elena Vasquez, at this small, soft creature who had revealed herself to be a predator beyond his comprehension, Kesrak found himself wondering if madness might sometimes be wisdom in disguise. You are dangerous, he said slowly. More dangerous than I ever imagined. Yes, Elena agreed, her smile returning, real and warm and somehow terrifying. All humans are. And yet you use that danger to protect rather than destroy. Most of the time, yes. Kesrak was silent again, processing, recalculating, rebuilding his understanding of the universe, one broken assumption at a time. Then, for the first time in his life, he inclined his head to a creature he had considered prey. Perhaps, he said carefully, the Galactic Council was right about your species. Perhaps humans are indeed very dangerous. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something new, something almost like hope. But perhaps that is not a bad thing. Perhaps the galaxy needs predators who choose protection over destruction. Perhaps my people could learn from yours. Elena's smile widened, genuine warmth spreading across her face. That, she said, is exactly what I was hoping you would say. The treaty negotiations concluded successfully 8 cycles later. But the trade agreements and diplomatic protocols were not the most important outcome of the mission. Before Elena departed, Alpha Kesrak made a request that shocked his household and sent ripples through Varkith society. He asked for a human tutor for his sons. Word spread quickly through the colonies. Whispers of the soft-skinned predators who killed with kindness and conquered through mercy. Other Varkith leaders began to wonder if they too had underestimated humanity. Other species across the galaxy heard the stories and reconsidered their assumptions. And in the years that followed, as Ren and Desek grew into leaders unlike any the Varkith had seen before, as their example spread and changed their people from within, the story of what had happened in that blood-spattered nursery became a legend. They called it the day the Alpha learned to see. They called it the moment the Varkith began to change. But mostly they called it by another name, a name that would echo through history. The day a human stood between two fighting cubs and showed an entire species what true strength really meant.